is CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. China's President Xi Jinping holds talks with his Brazilian counterpart, Lula da Silva, in Beijing, with plans to deepen the country's relationship.
In an exclusive interview with CGTN, President Lula da Silva tells us he hopes to see progress in the relationship between China and Brazil.
France's highest court approves those controversial government pension reforms that has sparked protests and strikes.
Germany's foreign minister is in Beijing and says a military escalation in the Taiwan Straits would be a horror scenario, while her Chinese counterpart calls it an internal matter.
Allumage Vulcain. Allumage AP, décollage.
And second time lucky, Europe's delayed mission to the moons of Jupiter blasts off from Earth.
President Xi Jinping says China has made relations with Brazil a diplomatic priority.
He welcomed his Brazilian counterpart Lula da Silva to Beijing for talks as part of the state visit to the country. President Xi called for deeper cooperation in sectors including agriculture, energy and infrastructure.
The leaders also discussed the Ukraine war and agreed that only talks are the way out of the crisis. Our correspondent Dai Kai reports now from Beijing.
So during their meeting, the two leaders discussed bilateral relations as well as regional and international issues of common concern. President Xi Jinping noted that China and Brazil are respectively the largest developing countries and important emerging market countries in the East and West Hemisphere. They are comprehensive strategic partners with broad common interests. The Chinese president, stressed that this year marks the 30th anniversary of the establishment of China-Brazil strategic partnership. So both sides need to deepen cooperation, promote existing collaboration projects. He welcomed more high-quality Brazilian products into the Chinese market, adding that China is willing to explore the alignment of the Belt and Road Initiative with Brazil's reindustrialization strategy. President Lula da Silva said he was honored and proud to lead his delegation to visit China. He believed that deepening and expanding cooperation between Brazil and China would help Brazil's reindustrialization process and solve poverty-related issues. He says that Brazil is willing to strengthen strategic cooperation with China within the frameworks such as G20 and BRICS. So on the issue of Ukraine crisis, both sides agree that dialogue and negotiation are the only feasible way to solve the crisis, and they called on more countries to play a constructive role in promoting a solution to the Ukraine crisis. And after the meeting, the two heads of state witnessed the signing of a number of bilateral cooperation documents in the fields of trade, investment, digital economy, aerospace, and more. And they also issued a joint statement.
In an exclusive interview with CGTN, the Brazilian president said he hopes to see progress in the relationship between the two countries that goes beyond trade and the economy.
Primeiro, eu gostaria de estabelecer com a China uma parceria estratégica que pudesse durar muitas e muitas décadas. Segundo, é preciso avançar na relação do Brasil com a China, não apenas na questão econômica e na questão comercial. É importante que a gente avance um pouco na questão, científica e tecnológica. É preciso que a gente avance um pouco, nos convênios entre as universidades. É preciso mais chineses estudando no Brasil e mais brasileiros estudando na China. Nós precisamos de estabelecer uma política em que a China se transforme em parceiro de investimentos no Brasil. E também eu quero discutir com o presidente Xi Jinping a questão da guerra da Rússia e da Ucrânia. Eu quero discutir a parceria espacial com os chineses, quero discutir, o investimento, por exemplo, da China na indústria automobilística brasileira. Ou seja, portanto, nós temos muitos assuntos, eu acho que vai ser uma visita muito proveitosa. Então, eu estou na China com muito otimismo, com muita vontade de que a gente possa avançar. Eu tive uma extraordinária relação com a China nos meus 2 primeiros mandatos e eu espero ter uma extraordinária relação com a China nesse meu 3º mandato.
Sergio Amaral is the former Minister for Trade and Industry of Brazil. He's also the Brazilian ambassador to Washington and chairman of Brazil-China Business Council. He explained what Brazil's president stands to gain from the state visit.
Lula wants to increase and deepen Brazilian and Chinese relations. And I'm very happy, as former president of the China-Brazil Business Council, to see that we are not only moving ahead, we are moving up, because it's no longer only trade, it's no longer only investment, it's not only investment by Brazilian and Chinese companies. We are moving up to some strategic issues, like finance, in which a Brazilian and a Chinese bank set up an agreement in order to favor and promote trade in local currency. This means that we are going to use more yuan and reais to promote our trade. But it's not only that. We are reaching areas of technology, and we are happy that Huawei took part in the Brazilian program for telecom. And we are also moving towards a stronger relationship in the area of new energies, like, for instance, the use of electric cars. So we are making a considerable progress by entering the financial area, and we're doing that in fully accordance with our own values, with our own economic interests, and 200 Brazilian companies are in Beijing now to foster this relationship. I think we share the same purposes. It's increase further trade, investment, technology partnership, and also to enter the financial area as a means with the BRICS of helping to reform the international system.
Germany's foreign minister says a military escalation in the Taiwan Straits would be a horror scenario. Annalena Baerbock is in Beijing meeting her Chinese counterpart, Qin Gang. China says relations with Taiwan are an internal affair on which it would not compromise, but that Beijing's goal was for a peaceful reunion. Baerbock's visit follows that of French President Emmanuel Macron. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Peter Oliver, in Berlin. So, Peter, these remarks from Anna Baerbock, a shift in tone from what France's president said about Europe not being drawn into the situation.
I think we were always expecting this different tone from the German foreign minister, especially after what we'd heard from the French president just last week. Of course, Emmanuel Macron said Europe shouldn't be pushed into or drawn into a conflict over Taiwan, particularly not led into it by the United States. That upset a lot of people in the US and some here in Europe as well. Annalena Baerbock, certainly a safe pair of hands when it comes to getting some of those who were upset back on side by saying that there needs to not be any developments, any escalations when it comes towards violence in that part of the world. She did just that. Pretty much what we were going to expect from her. She did exactly what we were going to expect there. She also spoke about trade, which you are going to get when you get high-level delegations from China and Germany coming together. But touching on the Taiwan issue as well, she said 50% of global trade goes through that waterway. Why it's such an important global issue? But of course, trade between Germany and China, a major issue as well. Some $320 billion worth of trade last year done between those two countries. Germany's imports from China up a third in 2022 compared to 2021. So, of course, that's a major issue that was being discussed between the two as well.
And what was discussed about the war in Ukraine?
Huge issue for both countries. Well, we heard Annalena Baerbock say that China should use its influence, its ability to speak directly to Moscow to try and get Russia to stop the fighting from the Chinese side. We heard Qin Gang say that China's position is that the way out of the crisis is through talks, that China would continue to persuade peace, to promote talks, and that it would not provide weapons to either side in the conflict.
Peter, thank you very much. Our correspondent Peter Oliver in Berlin. Professor Eberhard Sandschneider is a partner at Berlin Global Advisors. I asked him what Germany is hoping to achieve from this visit.
Well, that was the first visit of our still relatively new Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock. It was about time for that visit, because due to COVID, it would have taken place, under normal circumstances, it would have taken place much earlier. In other respects, it's nothing new on the horizon as far as the results are recognizable by this evening.
And what do you think it might mean for Germany and China's relationship going forward?
Well, the Chinese side certainly knew about her criticism. She has said nothing new. All she said today in the press conference with the Chinese foreign minister, she has said before. She repeated it almost word by word. So Chinese perspectives are very simple. They're looking to the Chancellor's office and hope to get better along with Chancellor Olaf Scholz. They do not expect too much for Annalena Baerbock. Her fundamental position of criticizing China for human rights violations, for Taiwan, for not acting on Ukraine, that is all well known in Beijing, so she didn't produce any surprises.
What do you think this changing, perhaps, relationship between China and Germany means for international relations more broadly?
Obviously, there is a tendency in the German government, at least, and in the German public opinion, to take a more critical and reserved view on China for many reasons. China is more self-confident in international relations. China is not really following the Western expectations as far as the maintenance of rules in international relations is concerned. China is turning into a formidable competitor for many of our companies, first and foremost on the Chinese market, but meanwhile also on the German and European markets. So things are changing, and that is certainly correct. If a country is changing as China is, it makes a lot of sense to adapt your policies. But what is true for China, that is the other side of the coin, which is usually not mentioned. What is true for China is also true for the United States. And here one could also say the United States have changed dramatically. So it is about time to rethink our transatlantic policies. And that is the fundamental challenge for German foreign policy these days. In between these two major blocs, the US on the one hand and China on the other hand, Germany and Europe will have to find a new role in international relations.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, the 21-year-old accused of leaking United States classified documents appears in court. We're live in Washington. Next.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. A 21-year-old member of the US Air Force National Guard has appeared in court, charged in connection with a massive leak of classified intelligence documents.
Jack Texera was arrested by the FBI at his family home in Massachusetts. He's suspected of leaking the data through an online chat room. The confidential files included sensitive information about the war in Ukraine. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Caroline Malone in Washington. Caroline, what further detail do we have on the charges Jack Teixeira faces?
Well, this 21-year-old has now appeared in federal court in Boston. It's his first court appearance on these charges, which are of 2 counts. One is unauthorized retention and transmission of national defense information. The other, unauthorized removal and retention of classified documents. These come under the Espionage Act. These are charges that he has been told in court could mean he will face 15 years in jail if he is convicted. We also heard just a short time ago from the Attorney General Merrick Garland, who spoke to reaffirm that the Department of Defense is fully investigating this case of how these classified documents got out in this way. The Justice Department has already opened a formal criminal probe as of last week. And there's really an all-out joint agency effort to fully assess the damage that has been done here. We're talking about reports of more than 100 documents that were leaked potentially by Teixeira. Now, the way in which it happened was through the platform Discord. And actually, Discord have given the FBI information this week about Jack Teixeira. Apparently, he used his real name and address for billing within that gaming group that he started under Discord. And in interviews, other members of the group, who are a collection of young men and boys, have suggested that he actually shared the classified documents to really show the others what real war is like, and also to really inform and impress them. But clearly he seems to have known what he was doing in that regard. Reports also suggest that he was sharing from as early as October, so many months ago. In this group in particular, they talk of many other things as well, of their love of guns, of memes, some racist comments, but mainly about war, and they're playing war-themed games. Ultimately, in this group, they saw Teixeira as the ultimate unofficial leader of the group, and they called him the OG.
I mean, you'll forgive people around the world scratching their heads as they point out this guy is 21 years of age. I mean, why did someone of Jack Teixeira's junior rank have access to these documents?
Well, absolutely. I mean, he was a member, he is a member, I think, still of the intelligence wing of the Massachusetts Air National Guard. Now, the Air National Guard is a state force. It's a reserve of the U.S. Air Force, but it comes under the remit of the Massachusetts governor. But the fact that he was in the intelligence group is what's key here to giving him that level of access to that type of information. And it's not uncommon. There are potentially tens of thousands of members of the military in the US that have that access to classified and potentially top secret documents. Now, Teixeira was arrested on Thursday, and we do know that, this billing evidence, as well as some physical evidence, was actually what tied him back to the leak. We've heard that he was taking photos of the classified documents and seeing them on a countertop in his kitchen, which had a distinct pattern, and that has been matched to photos that his family have uploaded, actually, of their family kitchen, and that looks like the way in which they have ultimately caught him.
Caroline, thank you for that. Our correspondent Caroline Malone in Washington.
Well, let's talk now to Ivan Elland, who's a senior fellow at think tank The Independent Institute in Washington. Welcome, Ivan. So, just how damaging has this leak been?
Well, I think it's significant. I'm not sure it was as damning as the Chelsea Manning leak a few years ago. You mentioned 100 documents were leaked. Chelsea Manning leaked 700,000 documents. So we have to put it in perspective. I think the tactical damage is probably manageable. The real question is, as you already mentioned, was how did a lower-level person at a far-flung installation in Massachusetts, Massachusetts Air National Guard, have access to this? And this is because he is in the intelligence loop on these systems. But after 9/11, we in the United States, the intelligence committee, the intelligence community took criticism because they didn't talk to each other. FBI and the CIA didn't talk to each other. And they say, we're collecting all this intelligence, but the intelligence community is so compartmentalized, siloed, that it's not getting to other intelligence agencies. And more important, it's not getting to operational agencies such as the military, the police, and other things that need to have access. So every intelligence agency in the world has this problem because they want to keep, naturally, their sources and methods secret so they can keep collecting intelligence wherever they're collecting it. But on the other hand, the operational agencies are saying, well, we don't collect this intelligence just because we want to collect it. We want to have access to it so the operational agencies and that sort of thing can act on it if we need to. And so this is a problem. And so after 9/11, we saw this group expand not only in the terms of their content, but in terms of their sources after the Iraq War when the sources weren't very good. So, but now I think we're going to see a contraction because of this. You've got to hit that sweet spot, and I think they're not quite there yet.
So that may change, you think. As you point out, though, a suspect case, 21 years old, relatively junior rank, questions being asked about how he can have access to this sensitive information. Will that change? Will the level of access that people like that have now change?
Well, it's not so much his rank as whether he needs to know the information. The problem is a lot of times people, get the information when they don't really need to know it. So yes, that will be examined, not only his rank, but what his position is. Does he really need to know these secrets?
And this isn't the end of the story, is it? This arrest and charges. The investigation will continue.
Yeah, and I think the impact on allies has been somewhat muted. After the Snowden and the Chelsea Manning incidents, that really damaged, I think, U.S. credibility abroad. I'm not sure this is going to at this point, but yes, the investigation will continue, certainly in his case, and also the real larger question is how tight do we need to keep this? Do we need to get rid of some of these 10,000 people?
Ivan Elland, I'm sorry to jump in. We are out of time, but it's good to speak to you. That's Ivan Elland from the Independent Institute in Washington.
Thank you.
Some breaking news for you. While we've been on air, France's highest court has ruled that President Emmanuel Macron's controversial pension reforms are constitutional. The ruling in the last few minutes means that the reforms could be enacted as early as next week. Macron's controversial proposal to raise the legal retirement age from 62 to 64 has sparked weeks of nationwide protests. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Nathalie Malhas, who's outside the Constitutional Council in Paris. Nathalie, tell us more. What do we know?
Well, we're hearing from French media reporting that this could all be signed into law within the next 48 hours. We expect President Emmanuel Macron to do just that, and not needing the 15 days that the Council has stipulated in order to promulgate this piece of legislation. This is exactly what Emmanuel Macron's administration had wanted from the beginning, to be able to lift the retirement age from 62 to 64. It's largely been touted a judicial victory and a victory for the administration, but there's still lots to come, because it was exactly this reform policy that had sparked widespread condemnation from protesters who had flooded the streets almost on a weekly basis since the beginning of the year. So as much as we know that several aspects of this reform policy has been offered the green light, there were sections that was dismissed, including the senior index, which would have required businesses here in France to tally an index of how many employees they have over the age of 55. So very much a victory for Emmanuel Macron and his administration, but the unions and the workers largely are not happy.
Nathalie, thank you for that. Our correspondent, Nathalie Malhas, with that breaking news in Paris.
Nearly 900 prisoners are being released as part of a deal between the warring sides in Yemen's long-running conflict. Dozens of detainees have arrived in Sana'a and Aden in one of the most significant exchanges between the Saudi-led coalition and Iran-backed Houthi rebels. The deal, overseen by the International Committee of the Red Cross, comes as officials agreed to hold another round of peace talks.
A powerful tropical storm has hit Western Australia with record-high winds, but most populated areas have been spared from major damage. Cyclone Isla struck before midnight close to Port Hedland, the world's largest iron ore export hub. It's since downgraded to a Category 3 storm, but a red alert remains in place for some inland communities.
A once-in-a-millennium flood has deluged southeast Florida in the United States, with 64 centimetres of rain falling over the past few days. 2 million people were placed under a flood warning after Fort Lauderdale saw its rainiest day ever, with a month's rain falling in 1 hour. Fort Lauderdale Airport was forced to close and is due to reopen later.
Staying in Florida, the Republican Governor Ron DeSantis has signed a bill into law that bans most abortions after 6 weeks. Opponents argue that this is before many women know they're pregnant. DeSantis said the law would transform Florida into a pro-life state. Currently, the state allows abortions up to 15 weeks.
To keep in touch with the news from China and our correspondents around Europe, search for CGTN Europe on the Telegram app. Follow the channel to get updates sent direct to your phone, including pictures, features and interviews.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, reasons to be cheerful. Carbon emissions from global energy generation may have peaked last year. We'll tell you all about it next.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference?
Brazen acts.
The difference is in the detail, in the background,
Defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. France's highest court has approved the government's controversial pension reform bill that sparked weeks of protests and strikes.
Our other headlines, Germany's foreign minister in Beijing says a military escalation in the Taiwan Straits would be a horror scenario, while her Chinese counterpart calls it an internal matter.
And China's President Xi Jinping holds talks with his Brazilian counterpart Lula da Silva in Beijing, with plans to deepen the two countries' relationship. Former Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff had her inauguration ceremony as president of the New Development Bank on Thursday. She talked about the challenges the bank is now facing.
Você tem razão.
The world now is under the threat of high inflation and restrictive monetary policy, particularly in developed countries. Such monetary policy means a higher interest rate and therefore a higher probability of reduction in growth and a higher probability of recession. This presents an important question for the BRICS. We need a mechanism, a so-called anti-crisis mechanism, which must be counter-cyclical and support stabilization. At the same time, it is necessary to find ways to avoid foreign exchange risk and other issues, such as being dependent on a single currency, such as the US dollar. The good news is that we are seeing many countries choosing to trade using their own currencies. China and Brazil, for instance, are agreeing to exchange with RMB and the Brazilian real. At the NDB, we have committed to it in our strategy. For the period from 2022 to 2026, NDB has to lend 30% in local currency, and so 30% of our loan book will be financed in the currencies of our member countries. That will be extremely important to help our countries avoid exchange rate risks and shortage in finance that hinder long-term investments.
US banking heavyweights reaped windfalls from high interest payments in the first quarter, brushing off a sector shakedown. Earnings from JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup and Wells Fargo beat Wall Street expectations. Let's talk to our correspondent, John Terrett in New York. How much of a litmus test is this for whether this might point to an end to the recent banking turmoil?
Well, that's Jamie Dimon you're quoting there, isn't it? The man who they call America's banker. He heads up the biggest of them all, the behemoth that is JP Morgan Chase, and he suggested this. The thing is, JP Morgan Chase and Jamie Dimon, they're an organization and a person that Wall Street listens to. So whatever he says, Wall Street takes it as gospel. And I think, in all fairness, he's said varying things over the last couple of weeks, and I think in all fairness to the man as well, we are in a situation where we just simply do not know where all this is going. We are in uncharted territory, and we have been for the last 2 years, as I've said many times on this program. So is there a banking crisis? Isn't there a banking crisis? Mohammed El-Arian, who is very senior at Cambridge University these days, Queen's College no less, and also a regular broadcaster all over America, said this morning, he said, look, can we just put a stop to all this talk about banking crisis? Do you mind if we just stop calling it a banking crisis and instead call it what it is, which is a mismanagement crisis, which is actually a slightly different thing, and I think it's not a bad idea, really. The trouble is some of the senior people in Washington have pulled levers which mean that we all think it's a banking crisis, and I have to say I think the issue hasn't completely gone away, frankly, but we'll see. Now, the story of today is that the biggest banks in the world have all reported fantastic earnings at a time when we weren't sure whether they were capable of doing that or not. So we're talking about JP Morgan Chase, Jamie Dimon's bank, Citigroup, which you see all over the world, it's a global behemoth, and Wells Fargo, which is not well known outside the United States, but is a very, very important, what you might call high street or main street bank here. And they've all turned in great earnings despite volatility and uncertainty. And JP Morgan Chase appears to have pulled off the impossible. They beat Wall Street. They've raised their guidance going forward despite the uncertainty. They've shown that the banking, the big ones anyway, are resilient, making money, and can handle their costs. A question, though, that all this leaves us, are the big banks on Wall Street, where I am, doing this at the expense of the regional banks around the country, like the two that have gone under, SVB and Signature? And that we don't know. It does seem as if money is pouring out of the regional banks, of which there are thousands in America, into the big, properly structured, well-diversified banks like the ones that we reported today. Now, the regional banks, which are very, very warmly thought of in America, and there are thousands of them, they won't begin reporting their earnings for the next couple of weeks, so we'll just have to wait and see. But certainly, on the face of it, it does look as if the big banks, anyway, are really in the driving seat, as it were, and they've done very well. JP Morgan shares, guys, were up 7% before the market even opened this morning. They're down a bit now, but they were up 7% before things even got going. And for a banking stock, which is, you know, here come hell or high water, really, that's a remarkable boost.
And who knows how successful they might be if they were in the office 5 days a week, because JP Morgan's boss has sent a memo on that very subject to all staff, hasn't he?
I know, he has. And there's a battle going on here between the executives on Wall Street and the staff on Wall Street. The executives, including Jamie Dimon, he wrote to his staff yesterday and said, look, I want all the MDs, the managing directors, back in the office 5 days a week. Now, in Britain, a managing director is usually the top of the company, and there's usually only one. In banking, and it's an example of how big these companies are. You have no idea how big these companies are. There are hundreds of managing directors in these companies. And Dimon is saying, look, if you've got a corner office, you know, you've got to be here 5 days a week because banking is a collegial thing. But the staff lower down who have not achieved the managing director grade, they are pushing back and saying, well, we don't want it. We don't need to. We can come in 2 days a week, 3 days a week and work from home on the other two because of computers. And, you know, we're quite happy doing it. Thank you very much. And I will tell you that my hometown, which is outside New York City, the car park there at the railway station is completely empty on Monday and Fridays. So at the moment, the staff are literally only coming in Tuesday through Thursday.
Apart from you and me, we're all here on a Friday. Look, it's been revealed today that on Tuesday, China's central bank governor met his US counterpart in Washington. Do we know any more about the detail on this?
Yes. Not a great deal. It's funny because the Africa team were asking me about this earlier in the week, and I was tempted to... I told them this. I said, you know, I don't think anyone's going to be meeting anybody. And then I stopped and thought about it. And I thought, well, hang on. That's the whole point of a spring meeting. The whole point of the UN General Assembly in September is that maybe these people will bump into each other in the corridor and in the restaurants. And it seems as if that has happened between Jerome Powell, the head of the central bank here, and a man called Yi Gang, who is the governor of the People's Bank of China. He's been there for the last 5 years. Now, we didn't know about this. Apparently, it happened on Tuesday. It's just being revealed now. It's said that they talked about financial trends affecting the economies of both countries. This is the first time China has sent a delegation in 3 years because of COVID. And you have to wonder, Janet Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary, is there. You have to wonder whether she has bumped into anybody significantly and had significant talks with anybody, which, of course, are not reported. But you just don't know what's going on in the corridors. And I will leave you with this thought, you know, the single most important economic relation in the world is that between Washington and China. And I know it's very bad at the moment, but more than any other relationship that Washington has, the Beijing one is key.
John, as a sign of our appreciation and affection, take the rest of the day off. Good to see you. Our correspondent, John Terrett, in New York.
French luxury goods company Hermès has reported a jump in sales driven by growth in Asian and European markets. Sales climbed 23% in the first quarter, above market expectations, as wealthy shoppers splurged on luxury fashion and accessories, despite higher prices and global market turmoil.
Boeing share price is down almost 5% after the plane maker warned of delivery delays to some of its 737 MAX planes. They found a problem with fittings to the rear of the aircraft, which could stretch back to 2019. The United States aviation regulator confirmed there is not an immediate flight safety issue. This is the latest in a series of setbacks for Boeing's MAX 737 since two fatal crashes in 2018 and 2019.
Japan has approved a plan to build the country's first casino complex. The resort's expected to open in the city of Osaka in 2029 at a cost of $13.5 billion. While it aims to attract around 20 million visitors annually, some have raised concerns about a rise in crime and gambling addiction. Casinos used to be illegal in Japan, but a 2018 law made casino games like poker and baccarat exempt.
Tesla has set up a new energy company in Shanghai with a registered capital of $2 million. This comes just days after the electric car company announced plans to build a new battery factory in the Chinese financial hub.
Carbon emissions from global electricity generation may have peaked last year. That's according to a new report. Electricity emissions grew by 1.3% last year to hit a record high. Our correspondent Paul Barber has the story. Paul.
Yes, thank you very much indeed, Robin. Well, there is good and bad news about global electricity production. On the negative side, last year, coal and gas power plants around the world emitted more carbon dioxide than ever before. But on the positive side, analysts at the Ember Climate Research Group predict that the rise in solar and wind power means those emissions may finally have peaked. Now, previous declines in emissions have been attributed to drops in demand matching economic slumps. But even with increasing demand for electricity to power a new generation of cars and replace gas boilers to heat homes, the amount of electricity produced using polluting fossil fuels seems to be at a turning point. The change has been accelerated by a spike in traditional energy costs resulting from the war in Ukraine and is largely being driven by one of the world's biggest electricity users, China. Now, as the world's manufacturing powerhouse, China uses almost twice as much electricity as the United States, but more of that power is coming from renewables. Solar and wind capacity increased last year by more than 25%, far outstripping increases in coal and gas. Almost half of all new solar and gas projects on the planet are being installed in China. So while the authors of the report warn that much remains to be done to avoid a climate catastrophe, they say we may have turned an historic corner. Let's talk now to one of those authors, Baroness Bryony Worthington, who's the founder of Ember, an independent energy think tank, also one of the key architects of the UK Climate Change Act. Thank you very much indeed for being with us on CGTN, Baroness Worthington. If I could start by asking you about the report then. You've called it the first accurate picture of the global electricity transition last year. Can we really confidently say that the energy sector has peaked? That seems really momentous.
Thank you, and thank you for picking up this story. This is the fourth year that we've done this. We've compiled data from most of the countries in the world, representing over 90% of emissions from the sector. And it's a really comprehensive look and a detailed look at what's happening in this sector. And what we're seeing is that there's a huge increase in clean electricity coming online. Most of that is coming from wind and solar, which is the fastest and the cheapest form of electricity generation available today. So unsurprisingly, we're seeing it being added in record volume. The downside, however, is that, of course, fossil fuels continue to provide the backbone of our electricity system. And as demand for electricity grows, those sources also increase. So it's possible to have also a record deployment of clean electricity, but also an overall rising picture of emissions because demand is rising.
And you mentioned wind and solar growing 2% last year compared to 2021 for electricity generation, despite, of course, the havoc of the pandemic. What's been driving that?
So largely it's the speed and the cost of deployment. So electricity is now in high demand, not just for traditional uses, but also as it starts to replace fossil fuels in other markets. So, for example, in transport, we're seeing electrification of transport, and also in heat markets. So electricity demand is rising, and wind and solar is the fastest and quickest form of new generation to add to the grid. So that's why that's been such a success story. Initially, these technologies were supported by government subsidy, but increasingly now that's not needed as they are cost competitive in certain parts of the world.
Now, I mentioned the big increase in China's wind and solar capacity. How do you rate the scale and importance of China's efforts to make this transition?
There is no more important transition, really, that's underway. China represents a huge amount of power demand, and it's currently being met predominantly through coal, which is the most polluting form of electricity. So China is seeking to diversify away from that. It's investing hugely in all manner of clean technologies, and its wind and solar deployment is the fastest and the highest volume in the world. And it's been assisted by really very well-designed policies, including the rooftop solar program in China, which has been carried out at a regional level and has seen a huge increase in rooftop solar in particular.
Well, Baroness Bryony Worthington, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and it's good to have some positive news, isn't it, Jamie and Robert?
Thank you very much.
Paul, thank you very much for that. You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, Destination Jupiter, Europe's mission to the icy moons, has at last lifted off from planet Earth.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The clean-up operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So into the attention of world leaders.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
And in these mountains, they recently finished building a power plant.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. It was second time lucky for the European Space Agency's most ambitious mission yet.
Vulcain, allumage AP, décollage.
The mission to the icy moons of Jupiter has blasted off from Earth after being postponed yesterday due to lightning at the launch site in French Guiana. Our correspondent Trent Murray is in the German city of Darmstadt, which is home to the European Space Agency. So, Trent, yesterday something of a disappointment, but today plenty of excitement where you are.
Yeah, that's right, Robin. I mean, there was a lot of very anxious faces at that moment of launch, and then when it successfully was able to lift up off the launch pad, that powerful Ariane 5 rocket with the JUICE module on board, well, then there were just huge cheers and clapping, as you might imagine, even some pretty big audible sighs of relief for engineers here, because there's been about 10 years worth of work going into this project, but it is now well and truly on its way. What we saw not just was the launch itself, but also several critical stages for the overall mission actually getting off Earth. We saw the launch vehicle successfully detach from the actual spacecraft itself. We then saw the spacecraft successfully connect up to its first ground station, which is in Western Australia. It was then beamed back here, and from that point, Mission Control was able to then start speaking to the spacecraft and also communicating with it. And then probably one of the most tense moments was when those vast solar arrays mechanically expanded out from the spacecraft, and they will be used essentially to suck up solar power in order to try and propel this ship all the way to Jupiter. Very important to note, though, it's not going to make a straight journey to Jupiter. Instead, it's going to loop around the planet several times. It will then go to the moon and loop around there, plus Venus. The idea being effectively to try and suck up some of that gravitational power to then slingshot itself off on that 8-year journey, this long mission ahead for the Europeans.
So, Trent, what are they actually hoping to get out of this mission?
Yeah, it's a very good question. When you really break it all down, this is a pretty unexplored frontier, not just for Europe, but also the international space community. When they arrive at Jupiter, what they expect to find are those 3 big moons, which are orbiting the solar system's biggest planet, being Jupiter. Those 3 moons are called Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. Now, they all are thought to have water on them. It is under the surface, underneath an icy crust, but nevertheless there is water there. And it's on Ganymede in particular that they are interested, because it is thought that it has 6 times the amount of water than planet Earth does. And combined with the fact that that same moon also has a magnetic field which protects it from harmful radiation out in the universe, what you then get, according to scientists here, is essentially the building blocks for life possibly being able to survive in that environment. Now, we don't know. It's a very big if, but we won't be able to answer the question unless we launch off on these big exploration trips. So we will have to wait 8 years for an answer. That's when we will start to get some of that data beamed back to us here on Earth. And it will be data that I imagine won't just be poured over by engineers here, but really scientists and engineers from right across the world in the global space community.
Trent, thank you very much. Our correspondent Trent Murray in Darmstadt.
Some of China's top composers have joined their UK counterparts for a special East meets West performance at London's Cadogan Hall. CGTN's correspondent Li Juanhua reports.
This is harmony between the East and the West. At the Image China concert, musicians from the London Philharmonic Orchestra and some top Chinese soloists have gathered in central London's Cadogan Hall. The works in the show incorporate traditional Chinese sounds scored for a Western symphony orchestra and Western solo instruments, aiming to bring the audience unique sonic experiences. Before the show, hours of rehearsals are needed to create the music cocktail. These musical notes help bridge language and cultural gaps between Chinese and Western musicians. Yet, this is no easy work. Yang Shufei, one of China's most renowned classical guitarists, said retaining Chinese characteristics while playing on Western instruments is the key.
Western instruments can offer harmony, polyphony, but Chinese instruments usually very lyrical. But they can do, they basically very melodic, very lyrical, very free. But they can create hundreds of ways of playing one single note. When playing Chinese music on the Western instruments, you have to retain the essence of the Chinese music, but offer something more on your instruments.
For Chinese classical music fans, the London Philharmonic Orchestra is a familiar name. Since the 1970s, it has had regular exchanges with Chinese musicians.
Well, we've been many times to many cities, and we've always had a very positive response when we've been there. Obviously, we played a very Western program, but we did some Chinese pieces as encores, and as soon as we started playing those, the audience erupted because obviously they were very familiar.
The Chinese embassy said there would be more such joint performances in the future as China gradually reopens its borders.
We're looking forward to having more Chinese people, to having more Chinese artists and tourists come to visit the UK. And we also welcome more and more Londoners, British people to visit China. We will have more cooperations culturally and in the other fields.
Back in the 19th century, Chinese orchestras would play European music, and many of those orchestras were partly staffed by European musicians. But now, as music education in China grows, the tables have turned. Eminent Chinese composers have a growing presence in the British concert halls, where they step out of the shadows and into the spotlight. Li Jianhua, CGTN, London.
Chinese boxer Zhang Zhilei is preparing to face British heavyweight Joe Joyce in London on Saturday. Zhang hopes to put Chinese boxing on the map and fulfil his own dreams of winning a world title.
到40岁了，我依然还在奋斗在拳台上面，所以说对我来讲。年龄只是一个数字，然后对我来讲不代表什么。年龄不会影响我什么，然后我知道我的目标，然后就是世界冠军，然后我就冲着这个目标，其他的都不。然后你只要经过系统的训练，然后有一个规律的生活，然后把自己的身体状态调整到最好，这样就可以了。大家好，我是张志雷，来自中国的一名职业拳击手。4月15日，我将与乔伊斯进行拳王争夺战，请大家多多关注。最大的看点应该就是他也是奥运会银牌，我也是奥运会银牌，然后我们两个体重也差不多，身高也差不多。两个人他是也是进攻型的，我也是进攻型的，然后就相当于。两个对抗啊，一定会非常激烈，所以说这场比赛呢，一定会非常精彩。2。如果赢下这场比赛，我就拿到强制挑战，强制挑战就可以挑战 WBO 的世界拳王，这离我的目标就差一步。如果输了的话，然后就再重新开始再去争夺这个东西。我是一个左架拳手，因为在重量级里面左架拳手非常少然后他们有时候打左架可能不适应，左手是重拳，所以说他们很难仿到我们的左拳。
Easy day, quite good. Thank you.
感谢你们的支持与关注，然后谢谢你们关注我，然后我会让世界再次见证中国力量。我希望有一天，中国的拳击像乒乓球一样，像中国的乒乓球一样全面开花，然后被大众全部接受，然后都融入到这个项目当中来，然后这样对中国的拳击发展会起到一个很大的一个促进作用。
Europe.cgtn.com has all of the week's top stories from China. Here's a quick take of some of them.
Hundreds of spotted seals have been playing and sunbathing on mudflats at the Liaohe Nature Reserve in Panjin City. State Councillor and Foreign Minister Qin Gang says China is keen to work with Uzbekistan to move bilateral relations to a new level. The China-Lao Railway has begun its cross-border passenger service. It's expected to boost regional connections. Brazil's president is eyeing more cooperation with China. The countries already work together on agriculture and infrastructure. There's been a bumper harvest of Xinjiang Maojian tea in Changcheng County, one of the most popular Chinese green teas. And a boat festival has opened in Taizhou City in Jiangsu province. There's more than 500 different types of boats and 10,000 people are taking part.
All that and more at CGTN.com. The headlines again. China's President Xi Jinping holds talks with his Brazilian counterpart Lula da Silva in Beijing with plans to deepen the two countries' relationship.
Germany's foreign minister in Beijing says a military escalation in the Taiwan Straits would be a horror scenario, while her Chinese counterpart calls it an internal matter.
And while we've been on air, France's highest court has approved the government's controversial pension reform bill that sparked weeks of protests and strikes.
That's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
More on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
And you can go to CGTN Europe's channel on the Telegram app or scan the QR code on the screen to get stories and updates sent direct to your phone.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again on Monday, same time, same place. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.